The morning light stretched thin across the Providence Municipal Court as Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses, preparing for another long day of hearings, unaware that one case would soon command the entire room's attention with a mixture of tension, disbelief, and raw human emotion. The courtroom, usually buzzing with quiet murmurs, seemed unusually still as the clerk called the next case, and the man named Aaron Blake, tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly agitated, stormed forward with a defensive stride that signaled trouble long before he ever opened his mouth. His jaw clenched, his eyes restless, shifting rapidly between the judge, the court officer, and the spectators seated behind him, many of whom straightened up in their benches, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Good morning, sir," Judge Caprio began in his soft, steady tone, but Aaron barely allowed him to finish before firing back. "No, Judge, this morning is not good for me, because I'm here over something that never even happened. Your officer lied, plain and simple." A ripple moved through the room, a collective tightening as everyone braced for the confrontation that Aaron seemed determined to ignite. The court officer, who had issued the citation, Officer Daniels, stood to the side with his hands clasped behind him, his expression unreadable, though the weight of the accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, not alarmed, not defensive, but attentive, the way a teacher does when a student enters the room furious over a failing grade, knowing that beneath the anger there is almost always a story buried beneath layers of frustration and fear. With a calm that contrasted sharply with Aaron's agitation, he asked, "Why don't you tell me exactly what happened from your perspective?" Aaron exhaled sharply, pacing a step before launching into his explanation. He claimed he had been parked outside a laundromat for only a minute, hazard lights flashing, waiting for his elderly aunt to finish inside, when Officer Daniels approached and wrote him a ticket for being in a no-parking zone. According to Aaron, he tried to explain the situation, but the officer dismissed him rudely and even stated that Aaron had been parked there for 15 minutes. A complete lie, Aaron insisted, jabbing his finger into the air as he spoke. The courtroom watched as Judge Caprio listened without interrupting, his expression neutral yet empathetic, turning occasionally toward Officer Daniels, who maintained his stance, every muscle seemingly held in controlled composure. When Aaron finally paused, the judge asked the officer to present his account, and Daniels spoke with professional restraint, stating that he had observed the vehicle for several minutes during routine patrol, saw no one inside, and noted the time before approaching to issue the citation. Not 15 minutes, he clarified, but long enough to verify that the car was indeed parked illegally. Aaron erupted again, insisting the officer had fabricated the time frame to justify the ticket, his voice rising with each sentence, bouncing off the courtroom walls until Judge Caprio gently raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Mr. Blake," he said in the slow, patient tone that had become his signature, "I'm here to understand, not to argue with you. I need you to take a deep breath so we can sort this out properly." Aaron hesitated, looking torn between anger and exhaustion, and after a long moment he pressed his lips together, nodded once, and folded his arms in a gesture that was half compliance, half defiance. The judge then turned to Officer Daniels with a question that surprised the room. "Officer, when you approached the vehicle, did you see any hazard lights on?" Daniels shook his head. "No, there were none." "Did Mr. Blake object at the time?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniels replied. "He explained the situation, but the vehicle was still parked in a restricted zone." Aaron erupted again, insisting the officer hadn't let him finish explaining, and Daniels countered that he had listened, but still had to enforce the law, and the tension between the two men tightened once more, like a rope pulled from both ends, until the judge stepped in again, this time with a firmer tone that commanded the room without raising his voice. "Gentlemen," he said, "this courtroom is not a battleground. It is a place where we seek fairness. I can only get to fairness if each of you allows the other to speak." His words settled over the room like a cooling breeze after a summer storm, and slowly the energy shifted as Aaron's breathing steadied, and Officer Daniels relaxed the stiffness in his shoulders, sensing the judge's intent to untangle the situation rather than assign blame. Judge Caprio then asked Aaron why he believed the officer lied, not in a confrontational way, but with genuine curiosity, and Aaron's anger softened just enough for the truth beneath it to show. He'd been caring for his aunt full-time since her mobility rapidly declined, and that morning she had been struggling more than usual, nearly falling as she tried to lift her laundry basket. Aaron had rushed to help her, leaving the car hastily, forgetting to check the signs, and when he came back out and saw the officer writing the ticket, his stress erupted into indignation, To him, being accused of ignoring the law felt like a personal attack when all he had been trying to do was take care of someone who depended entirely on him. The judge nodded gently, the pieces fitting into place as he observed the strain in Aaron's voice, the trembling frustration that wasn't truly about the ticket, but about a man stretched thin by responsibilities heavier than anyone could see from the outside. Then he turned to Officer Daniels and asked whether he had noticed an elderly woman nearby, and Daniels admitted that he had not seen anyone come out of the laundromat during the interaction. "It's possible," Daniels said carefully, "that she was inside the whole time and I didn't witness it." The room felt the shift, not quite vindication, not quite concession, but a softening of rigidity on both sides. Aaron swallowed hard, the heat in his face cooling as he muttered, "I just felt like nobody cared what I was dealing with." And Judge Caprio, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded, responded with the calm certainty of someone who has spent decades reading people far deeper than their citations. "Sometimes," he said, "when we feel overwhelmed, even small conflicts feel like the world is against us. But in this courtroom, my goal is to understand, not to punish what doesn't deserve punishment." Silence draped the room for a moment before the judge continued, asking Aaron whether the aunt needed regular assistance, and Aaron nodded, explaining how her health had declined rapidly over the past 6 months and how he had been juggling work, medical appointments, and caregiving with barely any sleep. Hearing this, spectators who had initially judged Aaron's temper now exchanged sympathetic glances, recognizing the weight behind his earlier outburst. Judge Caprio then addressed Officer Daniels, explaining that while the law was clear, there were also human circumstances worth considering, and Daniels responded respectfully, stating he held no personal animosity and had only been doing his job based on what he observed at the time. Judge Caprio absorbed both sides of the story before delivering his interim thoughts, not a verdict yet, but the beginning of one. He explained that the purpose of the hearing was not to determine who was a liar, but whether the citation was justified based on the totality of circumstances, and he complimented Aaron for eventually calming down enough to explain his situation clearly, and he complimented Officer Daniels for maintaining professionalism throughout the interaction in court. As the scene closed, the judge asked Aaron one final question. "If I were to consider dismissing this ticket, what would you want me to understand most about what happened that day?" Aaron paused, and in a voice stripped of anger, he answered, "That I wasn't trying to break the rules. I was just trying to help someone who can't help herself." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, a quiet signal that he had heard the man, not the anger, not the accusation, but the human being beneath it. And with that, he announced that he would review the full details and continue the case after hearing further clarification in the next session, leaving the room in a thoughtful hush as Aaron stepped back, no longer storming, but carrying the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone finally understood him.
The courtroom door clicked shut as the session resumed later that afternoon, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead while a hushed anticipation rippled through the room. Spectators leaned forward, sensing that the unresolved tension from the morning's heated exchange between Aaron Blake and Officer Daniels would now reach its resolution. And Judge Frank Capriotto entered with that familiar, serene presence that seemed to absorb anxiety instead of radiating it, settling into his seat with the ease of a man who had learned long ago that calmness is a form of authority. He glanced at his docket, then lifted his gaze toward Aaron, who stood noticeably more composed than before, his shoulders relaxed, his chin lowered, the earlier storm in his eyes replaced with a cautious humility, as though the hours between sessions had allowed the raw edges of his frustration to soften. Beside him stood his aunt, Miss Evelyn Blake, small and fragile, leaning on a cane, her tired yet kind eyes scanning the room with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude for the judge's willingness to hear the full story. Officer Daniels stood again at his post, still disciplined, still professional, but with a slightly gentler expression, perhaps influenced by the emotional undercurrent that had emerged during the morning session. He kept his hands behind his back, but even his posture held less rigidity now. Judge Capriotto, noticing Evelyn for the first time, offered her a warm smile and asked if she needed a chair. She nodded gratefully, lowering herself into the seat as Aaron hovered protectively beside her. "Miss Blake," the judge began, Your nephew explained that he was helping you on the day of the citation. I'd appreciate hearing your perspective, only if you feel comfortable sharing it." Evelyn cleared her throat softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper, yet carrying the kind of sincerity that drew every ear in the room toward her. She explained how her arthritis had worsened severely in recent months, how she struggled lifting anything heavier than a pillow, and how that day she had nearly stumbled while carrying her laundry basket, prompting Aaron to rush out of the car to help her. She said he had been inside not even 2 minutes, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from the frustration of feeling like a burden. When she finished, the courtroom fell momentarily silent, not because of drama, but because of the quiet humanity of her words. Judge Caprio nodded thoughtfully, allowing the silence to linger, as though giving the moment space to breathe. He then turned to Officer Daniels, asking whether hearing Evelyn's testimony changed anything about his assessment. Daniels took a measured breath before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, I didn't see Miss Blake come out of the building, and I had no idea she was involved. But I won't deny that her situation adds context I didn't have at the time." He paused, shifting slightly, a hint of inner conflict revealed in the tightening of his jaw. "I still believe I acted within protocol, but I also understand now why Mr. Blake reacted the way he did." The honesty of his statements surprised some spectators, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare for someone in uniform to acknowledge emotional nuance in a courtroom setting. Even Aaron, who had spent the morning accusing the officer of lying, seemed momentarily disarmed, the defensive fire in him flickering into something more contemplative. Judge Caprio leaned back, fingers interlaced, a gesture signaling deep consideration as he studied both men, not as opposites, not as combatants, but as two human beings whose worlds had collided in a stressful moment neither had fully understood at the time. "Your Honor, I think I was angry. I felt attacked, and I snapped. I thought he didn't care about what was actually happening, but now," he hesitated, choosing honesty over pride, "now, I think maybe he didn't lie. Maybe he just didn't see everything." A quiet, collective exhale swept through the room, witnessing the emotional shift, a reconciliation not forced but emerging naturally through shared truth. Officer Daniels nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than victory, and for the first time since the morning, Aaron returned the nod. Judge Caprio smiled faintly, the subtle, knowing smile of a man who had witnessed countless conflicts dissolve once both sides were given the dignity of being heard. "Mr. Blake," the judge said gently, "I appreciate your honesty. And Officer Daniels, thank you for maintaining professionalism even when accused of something serious. This," he gestured to the space between them, "is what justice looks like. Not winning, not losing, but understanding." He then shifted his attention to the citation itself, reviewing the photos, the location, and the posted signage. "Now, the law is the law, and technically, Mr. Blake, your vehicle was parked in a no-parking zone. But the law also allows for discretion when circumstances involve medical hardship or immediate necessity." He glanced at Evelyn, whose hands were trembling around her cane. "Given Miss Blake's condition, and given that you left the car only to assist her in a moment of physical difficulty, I consider this a situation where compassion must meet the law." Aaron exhaled sharply, relief beginning to crack through the tension he had carried all day, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "However," he said gently, turning to Aaron, "your reaction toward the officer this morning was inappropriate. Accusing someone of lying without full context hurts more than it helps." Aaron lowered his head, nodding in acceptance, not resistance. "I know, Your Honor, I was wrong." And recognizing that, the judge replied, is part of what allows justice to move forward. He paused, then delivered his decision. "I am dismissing the citation in full." A soft gasp rose from the back of the room, followed by murmured approval. Aaron closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed, and Evelyn wiped a tear from her cheek, whispering, "Thank you, Judge," with a shakiness that made even the court stenographer swallow hard. But Judge Caprio raised one finger gently. "Before we close this matter," he said, "I want to say something to both of you." He looked at Aaron first. "When life puts pressure on us, real pressure, the kind that leaves no room to breathe, it's easy to mistake enforcement for hostility. But officers have a difficult job, and they often make decisions quickly in real time based on what they see." Then he turned to Daniels. "And officers must also remember that every driver, every pedestrian, every person they interact with is living a life they know nothing about. Lives filled with unseen burdens, fears, responsibilities, and moments of crisis. A little empathy on both sides goes a long way." Daniels nodded again, more deeply this time, the message landing with undeniable truth. Finally, the judge addressed the room itself, speaking not only to the two men but to everyone present. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that most conflicts aren't fights between good people and bad people. They're misunderstandings between people who are hurting, stressed, or afraid." His words lingered, echoing softly across the quiet courtroom. Aaron placed a hand on his aunt's shoulder, his posture no longer tense but humbled. He turned towards Officer Daniels and said quietly, "I'm sorry for accusing you." Daniels replied, "I understand. No hard feelings." And just like that, the hostility that had electrified the courtroom that morning dissolved into something far more powerful: recognition, understanding, humanity. Judge Caprio adjourned the session with a gentle tap of his gavel, and people began to file out, murmuring about the rare moment of connection they had witnessed. Evelyn reached out to shake the judge's hand, thanking him again with watery eyes, and Aaron followed her slowly, the storm that once consumed him now replaced by a grounded calm he hadn't felt in months. As the two left the courtroom, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the space in a warm, almost symbolic glow. Officer Daniels walked out moments later, nodding politely to the pair before heading off to his next duty, carrying with him not resentment but a renewed awareness of the weight unseen burdens can carry. And Judge Frank Caprio, watching them go, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Another day where justice was not merely done, but felt, understood, and shared by all who were present.